Our next speaker is Sam Fuhlendorf, who was just told what he was going to talk about. But Sam comes to us from the Department of Natural Resources and Ecology Management at Oklahoma State University out of Stillwater. And I've had the great pleasure of working with Sam the last few years here on prairie chickens, and so curious to hear what Sam has to say. Thanks.
I'm curious as well. Glad to be here. Thanks to all of you that helped organize this. It's great to follow Rick. It seems like I've been following Rick all of my career. And I want to start out. So I'm trained as a range person, but many range people think I work on wildlife. Many wildlife people think I'm a range person. So I sort of bounce around between those. And I actually like that position usually, but about this project to me started about 15 years ago, and it may have been 10, 15, I'm not sure. There was a meeting in Buffalo, Oklahoma about lesser prairie chickens. And Dave Engel and I drove up, and we drove through cropland and juniper woodland the whole way. We got there, and everyone talked about grass height and native shrub densities and how important those were. And it just struck me that I was thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. There's no prairie. We're talking about managing prairie, but the problem I saw as I was driving in is there really wasn't any prairie. And so I thought about that all the way home, and we actually outlined this paper, and I wrote it over the next couple of weeks, a version of this that's been sitting on my computer until this special issue came out. So, which it needed to be substantially modified, but the idea was the same principle about how do you prioritize. It's not that those issues don't matter, but in the scheme of things, the big picture is if you don't have a prairie, then it doesn't really matter how you manage a prairie. So, and just to sort of get this back on juniper woodlands, this is a greater prairie chicken at the Stillwater Airport. And the reason it's at the Stillwater Airport is because you can't have juniper woodland now on a Stillwater Airport. And basically it's one of the few places in that landscape where it's actually somewhat similar to a grassland. So I can just imagine this bird flying over looking for prairie, and I'm sure it lived there fine for many generations. Actually, it's probably quickly dead. But so when we think about managing wildlife in rangelands, and what got me interested in the profession is these large landscapes that look awesome. Rick had some pictures of that, and that's sort of what I love about rangelands. I have friends that are birders and like to count birds, and that's cool too, but I really like to see big country. But in reality, when we actually think about what we spend most of our time doing, it's a highly managed landscape, particularly in the Great Plains. And this is someone's view of American progress in the 1800s, and it's kind of interesting. My favorite part about this is the farmers in the front that are cultivating the land, and I'm quite sure those are cedar trees they're planting. So this has a long history, but the idea is that we don't have this wild landscape that I often study and enjoy studying, but the truth is we've got a lot of other activities. After cultivation and woody plants, we also even have really intense energy development all the way to less intense. This is an area in the lesser prairie chicken region that has experienced substantial energy development. Brady Allred put this together with Dave and others, looking at how much energy development's occurred. And some of these landscapes have now more resemble industrialized landscapes than they do wildland landscapes. So you've got all of this happening on these landscapes. And instead of it's certainly in the Great Plains, instead of managing large landscapes with natural processes, we're managing landscapes that look more like this. They're highly fragmented, and the fragments have a lot of change that's occurring within the fragments that may matter, but the large landscape context certainly matters. And that's mostly what I'm going to talk about today. So if you've seen me talk before, I really love to talk about things that are made up from make-believe data because it's a lot cleaner. But in this example, I just thought a quick example. I spend a lot of time trying to convince people that large scales matter. And so I wanted to take a second and just sort of give you one example of how large scales matter. And this is looking at metapopulation dynamics in a fragmented landscape where each of the blue circles represents a subpopulation that's mostly independent, but you can have a little bit of interaction among the blue blobs. And what matters in this sort of context is the landscape connectivity and the ability of these populations to be connected. And so you can have local conditions that don't change, but broad scale conditions change and the whole metapopulation can blink out. So a quick example. For example, you can have a local extinction due to some local management or event that occurs. But when you do, if you can have some dispersal, eventually you get birds that disperse back into that area, or butterflies, whatever you're talking about, and you get this recovered resilience of this metapopulation. You can put in something that is fragmenting the landscape, and it doesn't even change the local habitat. And then when that blink out occurs, there's no room for dispersal back into that landscape. And so you have further blink out, and then if you really want to be doomsday, eventually you get sort of full-blown loss of this whole metapopulation. All the while, perhaps the local conditions haven't even changed. I think this is a real situation in the Great Plains in particular, but even in the West throughout. And the idea is that you can have lags and none of this is linear. And so you can have a certain degree, you can absorb a certain degree of fragmentation and populations can do fine, but then you can just add a little bit more and you can have this sort of collapse of the connectivity. So I've always had an interest in working in these sorts of things, but unfortunately, it's a difficult thing to study until recently. I'll talk about that in a second. So this is lesser prairie chickens in Beaver County, Oklahoma. And this is just the GPS locations. And we're currently working with these data. This is, they're about 20 miles apart, the leks, and they're sort of these subpopulations. But you can see that they're actually interacting with each other, but it's fairly rare. So this is likely some of this metapopulation structure that we're talking about. And so I think this is this is a reasonable model to talk about these populations. So I'm going to take a couple of examples. I'm going to talk about lesser prairie chickens in the West, greater prairie chickens in the East, and I'm going to go through an example of how we can use this understanding to come up with planning how to prioritize management on these landscapes. So we can start with lesser prairie chickens, and Christian will appreciate this. This is one of those lek locations, and you can see the dependency of this species on CRP. You don't even really need statistics to look at that. This is Ashley Tanner's PhD. And so this is essentially, the landscape is largely cultivated or some version of pastures. So about the only place they have fairly consistent habitat is on this CRP. So the local conditions do matter. I'm not actually suggesting that they don't. We've also looked at long-term changes in chicken populations with lesser prairie chickens. This is a study I did quite a few years ago, and this is looking at the increase in trees, and we have declining populations versus stable populations. over time, and then we looked at them at multiple scales. And the point I want to make here, so the scales are on the bottom. When you look close, there's really not much difference between declining landscapes and stable landscapes. When you get out to really large landscapes, all of a sudden you start seeing that the ones with declining populations are fragmenting more from increase in trees. So the point of this one is that A, trees are really important, but B, the conclusion we made in that paper is we studied fairly large landscapes, but in reality we weren't even beginning to get at large enough landscapes. So lately, because of GPS that's suitable for chickens, we've been able to get at some new kinds of data, and we've been, and with Christian, we've been working on some things where we're trying to look at how do these birds move among these subpopulations and across these landscapes. And so I have a postdoc, Julia Earle, and she put together this paper across the whole range where people have GPS data, where we looked at dispersal events. So this is a bird that moved about 20 kilometers, set up a new home range. We also found these foray loops, which I always think of them as birds going out to disperse, but deciding there's nowhere to disperse to. That's a little anthropomorphic. But then we also have even what looks like sort of migratory patterns. Birds move from one location seasonally to another location and back. And so what we're trying to do now is focus on these long-range movements. Instead of asking where will a chicken live, is actually asking where will a chicken move and what will they move across and what won't they move across. And this is a little bit of a busy, the point here is that these birds will move. And in fact, the example here is that they'll move as much as 70 kilometers. And it's fairly common for them to move as much as, say, 20 kilometers. So while these landscapes are fragmented, as long as you have some of these patches that are out across the landscape, we have something to work with. So we're ultimately going to do some more work on this and find out what they're actually dispersing over. The main point is that the lesser prairie chicken habitat in the West is highly fragmented, large tracts that have a mixture of cropland, woodland, and grassland, and it's very different than when we move to the east and look at greater prairie chickens. This is the Flint Hills. I'm going to focus on the southern Flint Hills in Oklahoma, but it's relevant throughout. So the Flint Hills are grassland still, even though they're in tall grass prairie, largely because of rocks that kept them from getting plowed, and largely because they burn the hell out of it. I mean, they burn, some places they burn every year. You can see from the graph up there, past in 11 years, some of those sites that are red were burned every year over an 11-year period. So there's a lot of fire in this landscape. In fact, that's one of the concerns with greater chickens is there may actually be too much fire. But it has kept it as an open grassland, so it's kind of hard to be too critical. But when you look at these populations, and Lance has done some of these studies and others and done a good job at highlighting that what you do on local property actually turns out to really matter whether or not you have chickens. So if you burn everything every year, then you don't really have very good nesting habitat because they actually require areas that have a lot of grass for nesting. At least that's their preference. So in this landscape, how a rancher manages his land can actually have a pretty substantial impact. So if we take these two and we put them up together side by side and quickly, and this is an overgeneralization. There's exceptions everywhere, and so I accept that. We could say there's not enough fire. There's very little fire in the West with lesser prairie chickens, and we've got encroachment of woody plants. In the East, there's a lot of fire. Typically, the grazing is done for uniform utilization. That's the objective. So different techniques in different regions. The landscape is largely fragmented in the west, but very much intact in the east. You could call it, from a landscape ecology perspective, course pattern is permanently heterogeneous in the west because you have cropland, woodland, grassland. In the east, it's large tracts of prairie. Fine pattern because of grazing management is homogeneous typically. The primary drivers are the increase in cropland over time and woodlands in the east or in the west, and it's actually grazing and fire management in the Flint Hills. So the interesting thing is the solution to both landscapes is you need this mosaic of fire, grazing that keeps the woody plants out, creates heterogeneity. But in one landscape, we've homogenized it from too much fire and uniform grazing. In the other, it's almost the opposite. And so the answer is somewhere in the middle, although that place doesn't really exist. So a way to look at this and to organize this is one of the principles of hierarchy theory is that landscape, broad scale patterns constrain local patterns. So if you look at this, a way to look at this is you have an intact landscape on the left, a fragmented one on the right. That's all increase in cultivated land and woodland. That means the inverse is native prairie decreases as you go from the left to the right. So the potential for us to do local range management on a fairly local scale is highest on the left, and it's almost irrelevant on the right. So the way I look at this is the greater prairie chicken is somewhere on the left in the Flint Hills, and the lesser prairie chicken is moved to the right. So the point being that you can try and get more grass and different grass structure in the west, and it's really not going to matter until you fix this constraining effect of large-scale patterns. Additionally, you can look at everything that's happening on these landscapes, and they're managed landscapes, and you can start to try and figure out ways to prioritize this. And we did this in the paper where we looked at the severity of the effect and the resistance to recovery. So essentially, if it's at the top, it's not going to recover. If it's at the bottom, it can recover. So we can go through a few examples here, and you can look at, say, fire and grazing. Generally, we don't think of that in the plains as having a threshold level effect. It can have, you can modify it to have a big effect or a little effect, but it mostly recovers from that, with a few exceptions. When you start to add other things, and obviously herbicide applications can be really broad, and you can have things that have a big effect and things that have less effect, but you can start to get some things where you can have a significant effect that at least some people would argue is associated with the threshold. In some cases, it keeps you from crossing a threshold for other things. Similarly, if you introduce, say, Old World Blue Stem or some introduced exotic, or you get invasion and you end up with a monoculture, you're not having a type change. It's still a grassland, but it's not really a prairie anymore. That can have a big impact, and it can even be a threshold, but it's not as big an impact as if you create a woodland out of a grassland. So a woodland to a grassland, you lose grassland species, you have a type change, and it's associated with a threshold. And then you have cropland and energy development. So the argument that I make in this paper with my co-authors is focusing on the things above the threshold and making sure what land we have below the threshold doesn't get above the threshold is a really high priority. So I've got 2 minutes I want to focus on. So I've had a hobby lately of reading about how bad our brain works. And it's bad. I mean, it's not just me, it's everyone. It just doesn't work very well. And one of my favorite examples is this survivorship bias, and the argument with the airplanes there is during World War II we decided we're getting too many planes shot down, so we need to reinforce these planes, but you can't do it everywhere because basically it weighs too much. So they went to the planes and they figured out where they'd all been shot, and they went in and started trying to reinforce it. Then a mathematician came along and said, well, you're doing the exact wrong thing, because basically it doesn't matter where the planes that came back were shot. What matters is the ones that died, where were they shot? And it's similar with business. So a lot of times in businesses, they'll have symposia, and they'll bring in all the successful businesses, and they'll tell you what they did, and everyone will think it's because they did something right. But they could have done the exact same things that the unsuccessful businesses did. They were just much luckier. And so we do the same thing from wildlife habitat. So if you're going to do a chicken study, the first thing you do is find some chickens, right? Well, that is in some ways a very incomplete argument. And so I think we have to spend a lot of time asking where chickens were and aren't anymore, as well as what are the conditions where they still are, if that makes sense. And with that, I may have time for a question. One, to make it a really good one. Any or not. Yeah, Urs. Right. Right. And so the idea, I was simply suggesting in a prairie, if you burn a prairie, it really doesn't have that much of a long-term effect. So it was more a one-sided argument. It's very observant. Quickly. Okay. So the question was, what do we do with roads and urban development? And luckily, in the Lesser Prairie Chicken area, there isn't much. So that's not but obviously that would be up there where at the extreme level of major alterations, probably more extreme than the things I talked about when it did occur.